March 15, 1956, 10:23 p.m. The Cotton Club, Harlem. 300 witnesses saw an Italian enforcer grab Bumpy Johnson, and the room went dead. 10 seconds later, that hand was finished. By morning, the man was erased from the game. Harlem remained untouched. What did Bumpy take that night so no one ever dared reach for him again? March 15th, 1956. The Cotton Club, Harlem, 10:14 p.m. The Cotton Club smelled like expensive liquor trying to drown out something older underneath. Sweat, smoke, and the quiet stink of men pretending they weren't afraid of consequences. Jazz rolled low through the room, not joyful, not free, just steady enough to keep wealthy people from downtown believing they were safe inside Harlem after dark. Cigarette smoke pressed against the ceiling lights like a lid, and the laughter had the wrong timing, arriving a beat late, leaving a beat early. Money was everywhere, but it moved carefully. Bumpy Johnson sat in the booth that never changed, table angled toward the balcony rail, back protected by wood and shadow, eyes positioned so he didn't have to turn his head to see the stairs. A glass of cognac sat near his right hand, untouched long enough to feel intentional, as if the drink was there for the room, not for him. His suit was clean, his cuffs precise, his posture still, the kind of stillness that makes other men check their own hands without knowing why. He looked like a man who understood that real control is not noise, it is the absence of it. At 10:15, a waiter started up the stairs with a tray and then stopped halfway like his feet had been warned by something his mouth never heard. At 10:16, a man at the bar reached to straighten his cuff, paused mid-motion, and let the fabric sit crooked as if order was suddenly optional. At 10:17, the drummer softened the beat and shifted the rhythm, just enough that the band sounded like it was holding its breath. No one called it out, because calling it out would make it real. The Cotton Club was full of men who carried weight in different forms, business owners who owned nothing on paper but controlled everything that mattered, politicians who knew which cases died quietly and which ones became public, and musicians who learned to watch faces because faces always told the truth before words did. But the first real signal wasn't who showed up, it was who didn't. The Italian regulars were missing from their usual edges of the room, not absent in a way that suggested peace, but absent in a way that suggested planning. No casual nods from the wall, no familiar shoulders leaning near the bar, no men drifting close enough to be seen but far enough to deny. The kind of absence that leaves a gap is always a message. The kind of absence that leaves no gap is a warning. At 10:18, one chair near the staircase stayed empty longer than etiquette allowed, and nobody took it. At 10:19, the elevator bell rang, and not a single head turned toward it, as if everyone had agreed the sound did not exist. At 10:20, the front door opened with a slow patience, letting in a thin slice of street air and a figure whose footsteps arrived too heavy for the music. He was tall enough to be noticed without trying, and built like a man who expected doors to move for him. His suit was dark, his hands were bare, and his eyes did not wander the room the way smart men do, because he wasn't here to read the air. He was here to cut through it. His shoes hit the floor harder than necessary, each step loud enough to be a challenge, and the crowd parted without being asked. Nobody stopped him, because stopping him would mean admitting what he was. Bumpy didn't look up. He didn't have to. The room looked for him. By 10:21, the man was at the base of the staircase, climbing without touching the rail like it might contaminate him. The band stayed steady, but the notes had lost warmth, turning into a kind of background discipline, a soundtrack meant to keep panic from becoming a scene. Men, March 16th, 1956. Harlem, just after dawn. The city woke up without announcing it. Milk bottles clinked on stoops. Buses hissed to a stop. Store gates rattled open like tired bones. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, Harlem felt the way a body feels after the first blow. Still standing, still breathing, already calculating what comes next. The night before had not ended. It had settled. Phones rang later than usual. A meeting that should have started at 8 waited until 8:27 because one chair stayed empty and no one dared fill it. A police cruiser rolled past a storefront it normally slowed for, then kept going, its tires humming like a thought being swallowed. These were not coincidences. They were adjustments. In 1956, the idea itself was the problem. A black man controlling Harlem was not a challenge to be negotiated. It was an error history was supposed to correct. The Italian families understood power one way. You entered a neighborhood loud. You heard enough people to teach the lesson. You repeated the lesson whenever memory weakened. Violence refreshed authority the way interest refreshed debt. It was simple. It had worked everywhere else. Harlem did not respond to fear the same way. Harlem remembered. People remembered who paid when rent notices showed up with red ink. They remembered which names made patrolmen change direction. They remembered who stepped in when a shop was squeezed too hard, and the windows mysteriously stayed unbroken the next night. Memory moved faster than threats and lasted longer than bruises. That was the mistake. Bumpy Johnson did not behave like a ruler. He behaved like infrastructure. He didn't sit on thrones or issue commands. He sat in rooms where decisions quietly resolved themselves. He didn't announce protection. Protection simply arrived before damage could finish forming. A landlord in trouble found his ledger balanced overnight. A shopkeeper stopped seeing uniformed men lingering too long. A mother who missed 2 weeks of work found groceries at her door without a note. No speeches. No gratitude demanded. Just continuity. That kind of power never shows up in newspapers. It doesn't need to. By mid-morning, Italian intermediaries tried to take the temperature and found no fever to read. Calls were answered politely and ended quickly. Requests were acknowledged and delayed. Nobody said no, but nobody moved either. Momentum died without confrontation, and that confused men who were used to resistance or surrender. Never patience. Harlem stayed functional. Money moved. People ate. Streets remained predictable. That predictability was the insult. Around noon, a small rule bent. Not broken. Bent. An Italian runner stepped into Harlem business without permission, testing the edge the way men always do when they think silence means weakness. He expected a warning, maybe a beating, something that confirmed he had crossed into enemy space. Nothing happened. He collected once. Then again. Then the floor disappeared. Calls stopped returning. Deliveries went missing. Familiar faces looked through him instead of at him. He wasn't confronted or chased out. He was simply excluded from the machinery that made money possible. By evening, he was finished without a mark on him, and no one could explain exactly how. That was the moment the balance tipped past repair. Italian power required reaction. Reaction required noise. Noise brought attention. Attention attracted people who asked questions nobody wanted answered. Harlem didn't need to ask questions. Harlem remembered. By late afternoon, Italian leadership felt pressure without a bruise to point to. Territory wasn't being fought over. It was being denied. Every move now carried risk, because there was no clear enemy to strike, no event to justify retaliation. Violence without a target is just exposure. Inside Harlem, nothing changed. No meetings were called. No victories announced. The system continued at the same pace it always had, which made the absence of disruption feel deliberate. Outside Harlem, calculations grew tight. Men who once acted began waiting. Men who once gave orders began asking. Names were written down in places that weren't books. Routes were reconsidered. Loyalty became expensive. Two systems were now facing each other without touching. One believed power lived in fear that had to be renewed. The other believed power lived in memory that never expired. They could not coexist, because one consumed itself, while the other simply endured. At the center of it all, Bumpy did nothing visible. He moved through Harlem like a fixed point. Conversations adjusted around him. Decisions arrived at his doorstep already finished. He didn't collect loyalty. Loyalty collected itself, because it knew where stability lived. That was what made him unacceptable. Not his violence, his permanence. Italian leadership understood eventually that this wasn't about territory anymore, it was about precedent. If Harlem remained independent under a man like Bumpy Johnson, then the rules were no longer universal. And if rules weren't universal, fear stopped being reliable currency. Fear can be challenged. Memory cannot. By nightfall, the question had changed. It was no longer how to take Harlem. It was how many men would vanish before someone admitted the old methods no longer applied. Each hour without action narrowed options. Each quiet success hardened Bumpy's position. Then came the realization no one wanted to voice. If they struck first now, they would look desperate. If they waited, they would look weak. Either choice carried cost. In Harlem, the cost had already been calculated. A final adjustment occurred just before midnight. A police captain who had once taken envelopes stopped returning calls. A favor that used to take minutes suddenly required approvals that never came. Authority shifted without paperwork, without ceremony, without fingerprints. That was the point of no return. Italian power depended on visibility. Harlem power depended on absence. One needed to be seen working. The other worked best when no one could point to it. Bumpy Johnson did not challenge the Italian mob directly. He made them react to a world that no longer responded to their pressure. He let their moves expose their limits, let their violence illuminate how poorly it fit Harlem's ecosystem. That was the strategy. Not confrontation. Containment. By the time the Italians understood what they were facing, the options left were all bad. Escalation would bring attention. Withdrawal would signal defeat. Negotiation would mean acknowledging something that was never supposed to exist. A black man in control. A neighborhood that answered to memory instead of fear. History had labeled that impossible. Harlem disagreed. The bill had not been collected yet, but it had been written, and everyone who mattered knew that when memory becomes the currency, payment is inevitable. Because power that cannot be erased will eventually demand to be recognized, and someone was going to pay for pretending it didn't exist. March 18, 1956. Little Italy. After midnight. The restaurant kept its lights low even though it was still open, the kind of dim that flattened faces and erased expressions before they could become evidence. Plates were cleared without asking, glasses refilled before they reached empty. Outside, the street smelled like rain and garbage and old brick, but inside everything was controlled, preserved, managed to the inch. The men at the table didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. Each of them already understood the problem, and understanding it was the easy part. Solving it without creating a worse one was where most men failed. Killing Bumpy Johnson would be simple. That was the problem. A bullet would make him permanent. A body would turn him into a story. Harlem would not forget a martyr, and memory was already the one thing the Italians could not compete with. Violence would refresh the wrong kind of loyalty, harden the wrong kind of resolve, and turn a local issue into a public one. Leaving him alone was worse. Silence could be read as fear, and fear spreads faster than bullets when men are watching each other. Letting a black man control Harlem without consequence would not just cost territory, it would cost credibility. Every other neighborhood would start asking questions no one wanted to answer. The room understood this in the same second. Kill him, and you lose control. Ignore him, and you lose face. There was no clean option left. Someone finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to move the air. The suggestion didn't involve guns. It didn't involve blood. It involved timing, witnesses, and humiliation delivered so publicly it could not be argued away afterward. A message without a corpse. The plan was simple because it needed to be. Complexity created leaks, and leaks became trials. This would happen in a place that mattered, in front of people who counted, with no room for confusion about what it meant. No bullets, no knives. Just a hand placed exactly where it did not belong. If Harlem saw their protector disrespected without response, doubt would do the rest. Doubt always worked slower than fear, but it lasted longer. It would turn loyalty inward, make people whisper instead of follow, erode authority without ever firing a shot. That was the theory. The room leaned into it. The Cotton Club was chosen because it carried weight on both sides of the line. Harlem claimed it. Outsiders paid to sit inside it. The right kind of insult there would echo without needing explanation. Everyone would hear it the same way. The question became, who? They did not need a thinker. They needed a body. Someone tall enough to block light. Strong enough to make the contact unquestionable. A man whose reputation arrived before he did and stayed after he left. Intelligence was not a requirement. In fact, intelligence was a liability. Instinct was easier to control. The name landed without debate, an enforcer known for following orders exactly as given, not as intended. A man built to break resistance, not measure consequence. He had survived prisons and street wars by doing what came naturally, moving forward until the other side stopped. That was why he was chosen. No one discussed what might happen after. After was not part of the plan. The instructions were clean. Walk in. Make it public. Touch the collar. Let the room see it. Say nothing if possible. Words complicated things. Then walk out breathing. That last part mattered. They were betting that Bumpy Johnson would not react in the moment. Betting his discipline would restrain him. Betting he understood spectacle well enough to avoid one. Betting that pride would keep him still. It was a bet placed on instinct, not consequence. By the time the meeting ended, the plates were gone and the glasses half full again. No toasts were made. No hands were shaken. Decisions like this did not require ceremony. They only required agreement. Outside, a car idled longer than necessary before pulling away. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not in Little Italy. He did not need to be. He had already read the board. The absence from the Cotton Club 2 nights earlier had not gone unnoticed. Absence was information. Information was leverage. He did not ask questions. He waited. The enforcer did not think about any of this. He thought about the job the way he always did, as a straight line from instruction to execution. He pressed his suit, checked his hands, and practiced the walk in his head. Confidence came easy to men who believed strength settled everything. The night arrived without drama. The Cotton Club filled the way it always did, with money trying to pass as elegance and danger pretending it was entertainment. The band played. Drinks moved. Laughter hit the walls and fell flat. The enforcer entered like a man following a script he trusted. He didn't scan the room. He didn't read faces. He moved forward. That was the mistake the room in Little Italy had not calculated. They had chosen force over foresight, muscle over memory. They had selected a tool designed to crush, not to survive the aftermath. They had assumed humiliation ended when the hand came away. They did not consider what happens after witnesses leave, because the real decision had already been made somewhere else, by someone who understood that public insults are only the opening move and that the response does not need to be immediate to be fatal. By the time the hand reached the collar, the outcome was already locked. The room in Little Italy would not hear about it right away. They would hear about it in fragments, in delayed calls, in men who did not come back, in problems that multiplied without names attached. They would feel it as pressure without shape, the kind that tightens until something breaks. That was the cost of choosing the wrong instrument. They had planned a moment. Bumpy Johnson planned an ending. And when power meets strategy, strategy always collects interest. March 15, 1956. Harlem. After midnight. The warning did not arrive loudly. It came the way real danger always does, through routine, through habit, through a voice that had learned to stay calm while carrying bad news. A taxi rolled to the curb without hurry. The engine kept running. The driver did not turn his head when he spoke. He didn't need to. The words came out steady, measured, exact. Not rumors, not guesses. Names, places, timing. The plan unfolded, sentence by sentence, clean enough to be believed, specific enough to be trusted. Who would come? Where he would stand. What his hand would do. What he would say if he spoke at all. Nothing was missing. By the time the cab pulled away, the night had shifted weight. Bumpy Johnson did not react the way men expect when they hear their own humiliation scheduled. He didn't pace. He didn't curse. He didn't reach for a phone to cancel the future. He stood still long enough for the information to settle. Then he let it sink where decisions live. Stopping it was easy. That was why he didn't. Killing the enforcer beforehand would solve nothing. It would erase the evidence and leave only speculation. It would look like fear to the wrong people and aggression to the wrong ones. Worst of all, it would rob the moment of witnesses. Witnesses were the point. The second option, surrounding himself with muscle, was worse. Protection announces weakness. It turns one man into a problem and invites a scene that can be spun later. Harlem did not need a shootout. Harlem needed clarity. So Bumpy chose the third path. He prepared. The preparation did not involve weapons laid out on tables or men posted in doorways. It involved alignment, positioning, making sure the right eyes were in the room and the wrong ones were not, making sure time would do the work instead of force. He broke it into 3 steps, not because plans need structure, but because consequences do. First, witnesses, not just any crowd, the right crowd, business owners who mattered, politicians who recognized moments before they became problems, musicians who knew when to keep playing, people whose memories carried weight because their words traveled. They would be there because they always were. He didn't invite them. He made sure nothing discouraged them. Second, timing. Nothing happens before its moment without losing power. The insult had to land when the room was full, when the music was steady, when the evening felt settled enough that disruption would be undeniable. Too early, and it looked like chaos. Too late, and it looked like desperation. The clock mattered. Seconds mattered. Third, the story afterward. What people believe about a moment determines how long it lasts. Bumpy understood that silence can speak louder than explanation if it is framed correctly. The aftermath needed to be simple enough to repeat and sharp enough to remember. No slogans, no speeches, just a sequence no one could misinterpret. Once the pieces were set, he did nothing visible. He drank his coffee. He kept appointments. He arrived at the Cotton Club like he always did. Men watching him for signs found none. That unsettled them more than panic ever could. Panic confirms expectations. Calm erases them. Behind the scenes, small adjustments were made. A waiter was switched. A door stayed unlocked. A candle was placed on a table where it would not be questioned. These were not defenses. They were props. The plan did not rely on chance. It relied on certainty. The enforcer would do exactly what he had been told. Men like that always do. They confuse obedience with strength and momentum with safety. He would not scan for traps because he did not believe traps existed for people like him. That belief would carry him forward. Bumpy sat with his back to the wall and let the night arrange itself. The band played. The room filled. Laughter settled into rhythm. The smell of liquor mixed with smoke and money the way it always did, disguising fear beneath routine. Time compressed. When the enforcer entered, nothing changed on the surface. That was the signal that everything had already changed underneath. No one stopped him because stopping him would break the illusion that the room was neutral. Neutrality is how mistakes walk freely. The hand moved exactly when predicted. The contact lasted exactly as long as Bumpy allowed it to. Long enough for the insult to register. Long enough for the room to own it. He did not strike first. That mattered. By allowing the touch, he shifted the entire burden of the moment. The enforcer crossed the line publicly. The audience saw it. Harlem absorbed it. Responsibility locked in place. Everything that followed would feel earned. The grip loosened. The man stepped back. He believed he had completed the task and survived the moment. That belief was necessary. A man must walk away convinced he won in order to be taught what losing really costs. Bumpy did not chase him. He did not shout. He did not explain. He let the room breathe again. That was the warning. Not to the enforcer. He was already finished. But to everyone else watching. It said the response would not be immediate, and therefore it would not be avoidable. It said patience had replaced urgency, and patience always outlives force. Later, when the night unwound and people stepped back into the street, the story had already taken shape. It traveled without embellishment because it didn't need any. A hand touched a collar. A man did not react. The room remembered. By morning, Harlem would still be intact. By then, the enforcer would begin to understand what it means when consequences do not arrive on schedule. That was the final decision. Once the hand touched him in front of Harlem, there was no turning back. Not for the man who reached, not for the men who sent him, not for the system that believed humiliation ended when witnesses went home. Harlem does not forget endings, and the ending had already been written, quietly, precisely, by a man who understood that the most permanent warnings are delivered after everyone stops watching. March 15th, 1956. The Cotton Club, Harlem, 10:23 p.m. The second the hand closed on the collar, the music did not stop at first. It hesitated. The drummer lost the beat by a fraction. The horn held a note too long, and then the sound thinned until it felt like the room had swallowed it. 300 people froze without being told to. Chairs did not scrape. Glasses did not clink. Even breath seemed to wait for permission. Time slowed because nobody wanted to be the one who moved when the line was crossed. The hand was big, practiced, confident in its weight. It pulled fabric, not flesh, just enough to make the message visible without turning it into a struggle. This was not a brawl. This was a declaration. The kind delivered when the sender believes the receiver has no answer. Bumpy Johnson did not rise. He did not stiffen. His shoulders stayed level, his spine straight, his feet planted exactly where they had been all night. The glass in front of him did not tip. That mattered more than anything else. In rooms like this, balance tells the truth faster than words. The enforcer leaned in close enough for his shadow to cover the table. He expected flinch or fury. He expected the rush, the sudden movement that would justify everything he planned to do next. What he met instead was stillness, dense and deliberate, like a door refusing to open. 300 people watched a man realize too late that he had stepped into a moment he did not control. Bumpy let the contact exist long enough for memory to form, not a second longer. Then he moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't slow. It was exact. His right hand came up inside the space the enforcer thought he owned and found the wrist. Not with a grab, but with placement. Fingers slid to a point that made strength irrelevant. A turn followed. Small, economical, and the grip broke as if the hand had been unplugged from the rest of the body. The enforcer made a sound he did not intend to make. Bumpy rose halfway from the booth, just enough to shift leverage, and delivered a single strike that did not look dramatic but landed where decisions end. The blow was short, controlled, and final. It did not invite a second exchange. It did not ask a question. It answered one. The man staggered back into the open space of the balcony, air gone from him, eyes wide with a new understanding that arrived all at once. He had expected chaos. He had expected men rushing in from every direction. He had expected noise. What he got was silence, holding him upright. No one joined in. No one shouted. No one reached. That was the discipline of the room asserting itself. Two men stepped forward without urgency, without instruction, each taking an arm as if this were a courtesy rather than an eviction. The enforcer tried to resist, found his body refusing orders it had followed all its life, and allowed himself to be guided because falling would have been worse. Bumpy stood fully now. He adjusted his jacket with one clean motion, smoothed the fabric where the hand had been, and checked the line of his collar like a man correcting a mirror, not a survivor of an insult. He did not look at the enforcer again. That mattered more than the strike. The message was complete. The men moved the enforcer toward the stairs, not dragging him, not rushing him, just keeping him moving so the room could see the exit happen without spectacle. He did not walk straight. His shoes caught the edge of each step like they no longer belonged to him. At the landing, he turned once, searching for something. Approval, anger, acknowledgement. He found none. Bumpy's attention had already returned to the table, to the glass, to the night that continued without him. That was when the meaning landed. The enforcer was not removed as punishment. He was removed as correction. The door closed behind him with a sound so ordinary it hurt more than a slam ever could. The music resumed on the same beat it had lost, as if the interruption had been planned. Glasses lifted, conversations restarted. Laughter returned cautiously, then fully, like a muscle remembering its function. Order reasserted itself without announcement. Bumpy sat back down. He did not scan the room for reaction. He did not check who was watching. He lifted the glass he had not touched all night and took a measured sip, long enough to mark the end of the moment, short enough to avoid ceremony. 300 people learned the same lesson at the same time. Violence does not need volume to be permanent. Power does not need repetition to be understood. Outside, the enforcer was placed on his feet and released, not shoved, not threatened. He stood on the sidewalk under the marquee lights, breathing hard, trying to gather what had just been taken from him. He was alive. He was upright. He believed for a brief and dangerous moment that this meant he had survived. Inside, Bumpy adjusted his cuff and leaned back into shadow. The band played as if nothing had happened, but the notes carried a new edge, a discipline sharpened by proximity to consequence. The Cotton Club continued its business, and that continuity was the final blow. Because what truly ended at 10:23 p.m. was not a confrontation. It was an assumption. The assumption that humiliation ends when the hand comes away. The assumption that witnesses forget. The assumption that power announces itself twice. The enforcer walked into the night believing the worst was over. Harlem knew better. By letting the music continue, by letting the room return to itself, Bumpy made the moment impossible to misremember. It would be told the same way every time, because nothing about it needed exaggeration. A hand touched a collar. A man responded once. The offender was removed. The city kept breathing. That is how rules change without meetings. That is how warnings last. At 10:24 p.m., the Cotton Club was already normal again. That normalcy was the message. It said the violation had been handled. It said the balance had been corrected. It said no further discussion was required. The enforcer would learn later what it costs when a correction is witnessed. Bumpy Johnson did not look back. He did not need to. The room had already memorized everything that mattered, and memory, once set, does not loosen its grip. The hand had been answered, and Harlem would never need to see it happen again. March 16, 1956. New York, before sunrise. The story moved faster than newspapers ever could. It traveled through kitchens before coffee cooled, through back rooms before chairs were stacked, through payphones that rang once and were answered without greetings. Nobody asked if it was true. They asked where it happened, who saw it, and what came next. By dawn, the version was already fixed. A hand touched a collar. The room went still. The hand was answered once. The night continued. That was enough. Men who lived by rumor recognized the difference between noise and signal. This was signal. It didn't need witnesses to swear affidavits or photographs to confirm angles. The consistency alone gave it weight. Every retelling matched the last, stripped of drama, heavy with consequence. That uniformity frightened people more than blood ever could. Phones went quiet in places where they usually rang non-stop. A meeting scheduled for mid-morning was postponed without explanation and never rescheduled. A delivery that should have crossed 125th Street turned around before it reached the corner, its driver deciding on his own that today was not the day to test anything. No orders were given, no announcements made. The underworld adjusted itself the way bodies do after injury, instinctively, without discussion. In Italian neighborhoods, men who had never been to Harlem suddenly spoke about it with care. They did not curse Bumpy Johnson. They did not boast about retaliation. They lowered their voices and changed subjects when his name came up, the way people do when a topic carries risk just by existing. The absence of rage was the proof. Anger demands release. Calculation demands silence. Silence began spreading outward from Harlem like a boundary nobody wanted to cross by accident. By midday, intermediaries tried to test the edges and found them unmoved. Calls were answered courteously and ended early. Requests for meetings were acknowledged and left hanging. No one said the word no. No one needed to. The message had already landed. Inside Harlem, the effect was subtler but deeper. Shopkeepers opened on time. Numbers runners moved as usual. Police cruisers passed through without lingering. There was no celebration, no tightening of ranks, no visible posture change. Stability does not cheer when it survives. It simply continues. That continuity unnerved outsiders more than panic ever could. Italian leadership met quietly, not in grand rooms or restaurants, but in pairs, in offices with the doors closed and the windows shaded. The conversation was always the same, even when the words changed. Escalation would draw attention, retaliation would create martyrs, another test would invite another lesson. None of those options improved the ledger. The hardest truth arrived slowly, and then all at once. This was not a moment that could be corrected. It was a precedent. Precedents don't ask permission. They sit and wait, daring someone to challenge them. The decision, when it came, was never written down. Men were reassigned. Routes were changed. Investments were redirected to neighborhoods where fear still worked as currency. Harlem simply stopped appearing on lists where it used to be circled in red. No press release marked the retreat. No apology softened it. Withdrawal happened the way embarrassment always does, quietly, with explanations offered to everyone except the people who needed none. In Harlem, nobody announced victory. They didn't need to. The absence of pressure was the confirmation. When days passed without a test, when weeks followed without a probe, when months settled into routine, the city understood what had happened. The line held. What made it unprecedented was not that the Italian mob stepped back. It was that they accepted the reason without trying to rewrite it. For the first time, a territory existed that they did not control. not because they were barred from it, but because entering it no longer made sense. That distinction mattered. Control taken by force can be challenged by force. Control acknowledged by calculation lasts longer. Men who studied power took note. Harlem had not been defended by gunfire or armies. It had been defended by consequence applied once, publicly, and then allowed to echo without reinforcement. The echo did the rest. By the end of the week, the story had crossed state lines. By the end of the month, it had crossed oceans. The details thinned with distance, but the core remained intact because it was simple enough to survive travel. Touch the wrong man. Lose more than the moment. Bumpy Johnson did not comment. He returned to routines that looked unchanged from the outside and had been recalibrated entirely underneath. Meetings grew shorter. Decisions arrived pre-made. Problems dissolved before they reached him, which is how true authority announces itself, by reducing friction instead of increasing fear. He did not demand recognition. Recognition found him anyway. Years later, men would still reference that night without naming it, the way professionals refer to known hazards without pointing. That kind of move, they would say. That kind of room. Everyone knew what they meant. Harlem remained untouched, not because it was defended every night, but because it no longer needed to be. The lesson had been installed. Maintenance was unnecessary. This was the new precedent. Not that violence wins, not that fear rules, but that memory, once set, governs behavior longer than any threat ever could. The Italian mob accepted it because the alternative was costly, noisy, and uncertain. Business prefers certainty. Even surrender can be rational if it preserves profit elsewhere. And so, without a treaty, without a signature, without a word exchange between rivals, Harlem became something rare in that world. A place acknowledged, a boundary respected, a territory left alone. The aftershock did not destroy cities or topple organizations. It did something more enduring. It rewrote the map in people's heads, and maps drawn there are the hardest to erase. That was the aftermath. Not sirens, not headlines, just a quiet, permanent adjustment in how power was understood. And once that understanding settled, no one needed to ask again what would happen if the line were crossed. Weeks later. Harlem. No date required. The story didn't grow. It compressed. Each time it was told, decoration fell away, until only what mattered remained, heavy and unarguable, fitting inside a single breath. That is how legends begin when they are real. Men who hadn't been there told it like they had, and men who had been there stopped adding anything at all, because fewer words carry more weight. Nobody smiled while telling it, and nobody raised a voice. The important part was never what happened that night, but what did not happen afterward. There was no follow-up and no second attempt, no man stepping forward to test the memory. In that world, silence after an event is not confusion, it is acceptance. The Italian families never announced a policy because they didn't need to. Their people simply stopped suggesting Harlem as an option, and maps were redrawn without ink or argument. When power retreats without noise, it is not weakness but calculation. Harlem felt the change before it understood it, because pressure that once arrived in cycles never returned. Life continued in narrow lanes and familiar rhythms, with shops opening, music playing, and numbers running as usual. The neighborhood did not celebrate because celebration invites questions, and stability does not advertise itself. Bumpy Johnson did not age into legend by adding chapters. He aged into it by refusing to. He built no monuments to that night and referenced it nowhere, letting the story harden on its own. That restraint was the final lesson. Power that needs repetition is insecurity, and power that needs explanation is temporary. People learned where lines were by watching which ones were never crossed again. Disputes ended earlier, negotiations shortened, and decisions arrived cleaner because clarity lasts longer than fear. Men who considered testing Harlem asked themselves a better question before they moved. Not can we, but why would we? That question saved lives, preserved profits, and kept chaos from spilling into places that did not want it. Years passed as the Cotton Club changed, faces disappeared, and buildings were repurposed. The rules stayed intact, because rules built on consequence do not expire with witnesses. New men heard the story and understood its purpose immediately, not as inspiration, but as instruction. Do not confuse humiliation with weakness, and do not mistake silence for delay. The smartest men learned to read what wasn't happening, paying attention to the absence of reaction and the calm that followed. That calm had been earned, and did not invite curiosity. Bumpy walked Harlem without escort because escorts suggest vulnerability, and he sat in rooms without raising his voice because volume invites challenge. He corrected problems before they became visible, which is the only kind of correction that lasts. No one tried again, and that was the proof. The absence of further violence was not mercy but efficiency, because repeating a lesson only cheapens the point. The Underworld adjusted its math as the cost of testing Harlem exceeded any possible return. That equation held through new bosses, new alliances, and new eras. Not from fear of what might come next, but certainty about what had already happened. The legend settled into something quieter than myth, becoming a reference point that required no retelling. Men nodded when Harlem came up, changed the subject, and moved on, which is the sound of an order holding. In later years, when asked why some men ruled longer than others, the answer was never strength, but timing, restraint, and the discipline to let a moment do its full work. Bumpy never chased his reputation. He let it walk ahead and close doors he never had to knock on. That was the final shape of his power, not dominance or spectacle, but quiet knowledge lodged deep in other men's thinking. Certain lines do not forgive curiosity, and certain consequences do not fade. The city remembered because it was allowed to, preserving memory through consistency rather than blood or noise. Consistency outlives everything else, and that was the order that followed. Real power is not the strike you deliver, but the strike no one ever dares to attempt again. The music kept playing, the city kept moving, and Harlem stayed exactly where it was. The night didn't end with sirens or applause. It ended quietly, the way real order always does, without witnesses asking questions. Harlem woke up unchanged on the surface, but underneath, something had locked into place and refused to move again. Bumpy Johnson didn't explain what followed, and he didn't repeat it. He let memory do the work, because memory lasts longer than fear and travels farther than bullets ever could. Years passed. Faces changed. Buildings fell and rose again. The line stayed where it was drawn, not because it was guarded, but because no one dared test what had already been proven. This wasn't about violence winning. It was about control replacing noise. And if this moment stayed with you, there are others like it. Quiet, decisive, and still waiting to be told.